Karen mocks Muslim woman at a cafe, then learns she's a celebrity lawyer. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The cafe was bustling with the usual morning crowd, professionals grabbing their coffee before work, students huddled in corners with laptops, and retirees leisurely reading their newspapers. The scent of freshly brewed espresso filled the air, blending with the faint hum of conversation and the occasional clang of cups against saucers. At a corner table near the window, Karen stirred her cappuccino absent-mindedly, watching the flow of people with mild disinterest. She had been coming to this cafe for years, always ordering the same drink, always sitting in the same spot, always enjoying the routine. And then she walked in. A woman in a tailored blazer, headscarf neatly wrapped, moving with quiet confidence. She approached the counter and gave the barista a polite smile, placing her order with a tone that was both measured and refined. Karen's eyes narrowed. She didn't like seeing people like that in her favorite places. Why couldn't they just blend in? She turned her attention back to her coffee, trying to push away the irritation creeping up her spine. But the barista's next words made her look up again. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but our card reader is down. Do you happen to have cash?" The woman hesitated, patting her blazer pockets before shaking her head. "I don't think I do. Let me check my bag." Karen smirked. Typical. She had seen it before, people fumbling, delaying the line, making a fuss over something as simple as paying for coffee. With an exaggerated sigh, she stood up and walked over. "Unbelievable," she muttered just loud enough for the woman to hear. "If you can't even pay, why come in the first place?" The barista froze. A few nearby customers turned to look. The woman at the counter straightened, her expression unreadable. Karen wasn't finished. "I swear this place is getting worse. Letting in people who," she gestured vaguely, voice dripping with condescension, "don't even belong here." A thick silence settled over the cafe. The woman's fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her purse, but when she turned to Karen, her face was calm, unbothered. And somehow that infuriated Karen even more. "I didn't ask for your help," the woman said simply. Her voice was smooth, steady. "And I certainly don't need your commentary." Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." One of the baristas opened their mouth, ready to intervene, but before they could, the cafe doors swung open, and a young man in a crisp suit hurried inside, eyes scanning the room. The moment he spotted the woman, his face lit up. "There you are. I've been trying to reach you." Karen frowned. "Who was this?" The man strode toward the counter with an air of urgency and respect. He extended a sleek black credit card to the barista without hesitation. "Charge it to my account," he said. Then turning to the woman, he added, "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Your driver got caught in traffic and your assistant asked me to come ahead. I didn't realize you'd already arrived." Karen blinked. "Driver? Assistant? Account?" The woman sighed but gave him a small smile. "Thank you, James. But it wasn't a big deal." The barista quickly rang up the order, visibly relieved to break the tension. But Karen wasn't focused on the transaction anymore. Her stomach was twisting. Something was wrong. This woman she had just humiliated, wasn't just some random cafe patron. The young man seemed to know exactly who she was. And then it happened. Another customer, a woman sitting near the window, let out a quiet gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's her." Karen's pulse skipped. The customer reached for her phone, scrolling quickly before holding up the screen. Karen didn't want to look, but she did. And in an instant, her stomach dropped. Because on that screen, staring back at her, was the very woman she had just insulted. In a headline, on a major news site, "Prominent civil rights lawyer makes history in landmark discrimination case." Karen stopped breathing. The woman she had just mocked, the woman she had called out in front of an entire cafe, wasn't just someone important. She was famous. And Karen? Karen had just made a very, very big mistake. Karen's throat went dry as she stared at the phone screen. The image of the woman, the same woman she had just mocked, was accompanied by an article detailing a high-profile legal case that had made national headlines. A landmark ruling. A groundbreaking victory. A name that commanded respect in courtrooms across the country. And Karen had just humiliated her in a cafe. Her mouth opened, then closed. The cafe had gone eerily silent. People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The lawyer, or rather, the woman Karen had dismissed as an inconvenience, turned to face her fully now. But there was no anger in her expression. No smugness. Just disappointment. Karen felt a strange sensation creeping up her spine. Shame. For the first time, she realized exactly what she had done. The young man, James, her assistant, cleared his throat. "Ms. El-Fayed," he said carefully, "I can have the car brought around whenever you're ready." Karen's stomach twisted again. Ms. El-Fayed. She knew that name. Not just from the article. Not just from the case. She had heard it before, on the news, in conversations, in debates about civil rights, justice, and the future of the legal system. And now, standing just a few feet away, was that Ms. El-Fayed. The one she had just mocked. The one who had fought for people's rights in courtrooms far bigger than this cafe. The one who had just listened to Karen belittle her, humiliate her, reduce her to a stereotype. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. She should say something. She should apologize. But before she could open her mouth, Ms. El-Fayed spoke first. "You seem surprised," she said, her voice calm, measured. "Why is that?" Karen swallowed hard. Ms. El-Fayed didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out, didn't demand anything. And somehow that was worse. Karen wished she had yelled. Instead, she was looking at Karen the way a teacher looks at a student who should know better. Karen glanced around, realizing that everyone was still watching. The barista, the other customers, even the woman with the phone. They were all waiting. Karen felt her pride battling against her shame. I didn't know who you were," she stammered. Ms. El-Fayed's eyes didn't waver. Would it have made a difference? Karen flinched, because the answer was no. It shouldn't have mattered who she was. But it did. Because Karen hadn't seen a person. She had seen an inconvenience. A few beats of silence passed before Ms. El-Fayed sighed and turned back to the counter, lifting her coffee cup. She wasn't going to press the moment further. Karen could feel it, the opportunity slipping away. If she walked out now, if she said nothing, she would carry this humiliation with her forever. But apologizing? That would mean admitting she had been wrong. Her hands clenched at her sides. She could still walk away. She could pretend this never happened. But she knew deep down she would never forget it. And neither would anyone else in this cafe. Her voice came out small. Ms. El-Fayed turned slightly, waiting. Karen exhaled shakily. "I'm sorry." The words felt foreign, uncomfortable. But she said them anyway. Ms. El-Fayed studied her for a moment before nodding once. "I hope you are," she said, her tone neither cruel nor forgiving. Just honest. Karen felt like she had just been sentenced. And maybe she had. Without another word, Ms. El-Fayed turned back to James, walking toward the exit, dismissing Karen entirely. And Karen? She was left standing there, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the realization sinking in. She had just insulted one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. And for the first time in her life, there was no excuse that could save her. Karen stood frozen, her breath shallow, as Ms. El-Fayed strode toward the exit, James following close behind. The cafe remained silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. No one moved. No one spoke. Karen could feel the weight of every single pair of eyes on her. She was exposed, her behavior laid bare for everyone to see. There was no hiding, no justifying, no brushing this off. She had humiliated someone far more powerful, far more influential than she had assumed. And now she was the one left feeling small. She turned slowly, locking eyes with the barista behind the counter. The young woman gave her a look, not one of anger, not even of pity. Just disappointment. Karen clenched her jaw, grabbing her purse. She needed to leave. She pushed through the cafe doors, stepping into the crisp afternoon air, desperate for an escape. But before she could even take a step forward, she heard someone call out. "Excuse me." Her stomach turned. She didn't need to look back to know who it was. Ms. El-Fayed stood just outside, adjusting the strap of her designer handbag, her expression unreadable. Karen swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. Hadn't this been enough? Ms. El-Fayed didn't speak immediately. She studied Karen, her sharp, intelligent gaze peeling back layers, seeing everything. "I need you to understand something," she finally said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "What you did in there, it wasn't just rude. It wasn't just ignorant." Karen flinched. "It was a reflection of how you see people like me," Ms. El-Fayed continued. "Or rather, how you don't see us." Karen's fingers curled around the strap of her purse. Ms. El-Fayed shook her head slightly, exhaling. "You assumed you knew me the second you saw me. You assumed I was someone who didn't belong in your space. And why?" Karen couldn't answer. Because the answer was ugly. Ms. El-Fayed gave her a long, piercing look before nodding, almost to herself. "You should ask yourself that." Karen's breath hitched. 4 years she had been the one doing the judging, making the assumptions, deciding who belonged and who didn't. Now for the first time she was the one being weighed and measured. And she had come up short. Ms. Al-Fayed didn't wait for a response. She turned, stepping toward the sleek black car that had just pulled up to the curb. Karen could do nothing but watch. The door opened, and before stepping inside, Ms. Al-Fayed glanced back one last time. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her silence was the loudest condemnation of all. The door shut and the car pulled away, leaving Karen standing there, alone, exposed and drowning in her own reflection. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. And it terrified her. Karen stood on the sidewalk long after Ms. Al-Fayed's car disappeared down the street. The afternoon air was cool, but she felt uncomfortably warm, her skin prickling with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. She could feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest. She had humiliated a woman in front of an entire cafe, assuming she was just some nobody who didn't belong. And now she had to live with the fact that everyone had seen her for what she really was. Judgmental. Small-minded. Wrong. She turned back toward the cafe, but she knew she couldn't go inside. Not after that. Not after how they had all looked at her. The barista's disappointed stare. The hushed whispers. The way the woman by the window had gasped when she realized who Ms. Al-Fayed was. Karen had always thought of herself as someone who knew how the world worked. She had always believed she could read people instantly. But she had been so wrong. And for the first time, she didn't have a way to explain it away. Her usual excuses, I was just speaking my mind, I was just saying what everyone else was thinking, I was just being honest, they all rang hollow now. Because what if it wasn't honesty? What if it was just ugliness? Karen exhaled sharply, gripping the strap of her purse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had to go. She had to get away from this place, from these people who had all seen her at her worst. She turned down the street and walked fast, her heels clicking against the pavement. But no matter how far she got from that cafe, she couldn't outrun what had just happened. The memory of Ms. Al-Fayed's face, calm, unwavering, and utterly unimpressed by her behavior, it wouldn't leave her. And that bothered Karen more than anything. She had expected anger, outrage, retaliation. Instead, she had been met with nothing but quiet disappointment. It made her feel small, and she hated that feeling. She walked past a newspaper stand and froze when she saw the front page of the daily paper. Right there, bold and impossible to miss, was another headline about Ms. Al-Fayed. Prominent lawyer rumored to be representing high-profile discrimination case. Karen's stomach twisted. She knew the case. Everyone did. It was a massive lawsuit against a corporation that had systematically denied opportunities to marginalized employees. A case that could change employment law across the country. And Ms. Al-Fayed was the woman leading it. Karen felt sick. She had mocked a woman who was literally fighting for fairness in the world. And what had Karen done? Tried to tear her down over a cup of coffee. The realization was a punch to the gut. She had always thought of herself as a good person. But what if she wasn't? What if she was just another person standing in the way of something bigger than herself? Karen turned away from the newspaper stand and kept walking, faster this time. She needed to think. She needed to figure out why this was bothering her so much. And more than anything, she needed to face the fact that for the first time in her life, she might actually need to change. Karen walked briskly through the streets, her mind racing, her stomach a tight knot of discomfort. The world around her carried on as usual, cars passing, people chatting on sidewalks, life moving forward. But inside her, everything felt off. She had been humiliated before, sure. She had even lost arguments. But this was different. This wasn't about losing. This was about being wrong. And Karen hated being wrong. She replayed the moment in the cafe over and over again in her head. The way the air had shifted the second Ms. Al-Fayed's name had been spoken. The way the young assistant had rushed to help. The way the other customers had stared at her as if she was the one who didn't belong. And maybe, for the first time in her life, she really didn't. The thought made her feel cold despite the warm afternoon sun. She turned down a side street, hoping the quieter path would help clear her mind. But it didn't. The newspaper stand's headline kept flashing in her head. Prominent lawyer rumored to be representing high-profile discrimination case. Karen knew about the case. It had been all over the news. A lawsuit against a major corporation that had refused to promote or fairly compensate its employees of color. A case that would change things. And the woman she had just belittled in a cafe was at the center of it. Karen exhaled sharply. What were the chances? What were the chances that, of all the people she could have insulted, she had picked the one person who was more powerful, more respected, and more important than she could have imagined? Her own ignorance burned in her chest. She had seen a woman in a headscarf and made an assumption. She had thought she could get away with it, because she always had before. But this time? This time the world had pushed back. Karen rubbed her hands over her face, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. But it wouldn't leave. For the first time, she wasn't just embarrassed. She was questioning herself. She kept walking, her thoughts heavy. The sounds of the city blurred together. Then suddenly a voice called out. "Excuse me, miss?" Karen turned and saw an older man standing near a bench, holding a folded newspaper. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his silver-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "Are you all right?" he asked. Karen blinked. Yeah, I'm fine." The man studied her for a moment before unfolding his newspaper. It was the same one from the stand. The one with Ms. Al-Fayed's face on the front page. "You seem troubled," he said, glancing at the headline. "This case must be making a lot of people uncomfortable." Karen swallowed, feeling seen in a way she didn't like. "I guess," she muttered. The man gave her a small, knowing smile. "Change always does." Karen didn't respond. She couldn't. Because she realized right then and there that she was the kind of person who always fought against change. And maybe, just maybe, that was the problem. She didn't say another word. She simply nodded, turned, and kept walking. But this time, for the first time in years, she wasn't walking away from the problem. She was walking toward something she had never considered before. The possibility that she could be different. Karen walked without direction, lost in her own thoughts. The noise of the city faded as her mind replayed everything. Her words, the looks of the cafe customers, the weight of Ms. Alfed's unimpressed stare. The truth settled in her stomach like a stone. She had spent years believing she was always right. That people who pushed for change were just too sensitive. That her comments, her judgments, her dismissiveness, they weren't a problem. But today she had been the problem. She turned a corner and found herself standing in front of a bookstore. The large glass window displayed a variety of books, and among them was a familiar face. Ms. Al-Fayed's face. Karen's breath caught in her throat. There, prominently displayed in the window, was a book with her name across the cover. Justice in a Changing World, How Law Shapes the Fight for Equality by Layla Al-Fayed. Karen's pulse skipped. She had a book? Karen had thought she had insulted some random woman in a cafe, but she had insulted a lawyer, an activist, a public figure, an author. The humiliation deepened. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the back cover, searching for anything that would tell her more. The description was clear. Layla Al-Fayed has spent her career fighting for justice. As one of the most influential civil rights lawyers of her generation, she has worked tirelessly to challenge discrimination, defend marginalized communities, and ensure that justice is served for all. Karen exhaled slowly. She had walked into that cafe thinking she knew everything about the world, that she could make a snide comment and move on like she always did. But this time she had mocked someone who had spent their life fighting for fairness. And now she was standing here, realizing how little she actually knew. Her fingers itched to grab the book, to open it, to read it, to understand why Ms. Al-Fayed's presence, her words, her entire existence had rattled her so much. But instead, Karen hesitated. Because doing that, actually learning, actually listening, meant admitting she had been wrong. And wasn't that what she had fought against her whole life? Her pride screamed at her to walk away, to pretend none of this had happened. But her gut told her that if she walked away now, she would carry this feeling, this shame, this discomfort, this gnawing doubt, forever. A small voice inside her, one she had ignored for years, whispered, "You don't have to be this person anymore." And for the first time, Karen actually listened. She reached for the book, gripping its edges tightly. Then, without another thought, she walked inside and bought it. Because she didn't just want to move past this moment. She wanted to understand why it had happened in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to change. Karen carried the book out of the store, her grip tight, her heartbeat uneven. She didn't know why she had bought it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in her life she was questioning herself. Whatever it was, she wasn't ready to face it yet. She shoved the book into her bag and walked toward home, trying to shake off the strange weight in her chest. By the time she reached her apartment, she was exhausted, not physically but mentally. The day had drained her. She tossed her purse onto the kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at the dining table, staring at the bag where the book lay hidden. It felt like it was staring back. She had always been confident in her beliefs. She had always thought she knew how the world worked. But today had been a wake-up call. And the worst part? She had no one to blame but herself. She pulled the book out, running her fingers over the title. Justice in a Changing World. Karen had spent so much of her life rejecting change. Maybe it was time to actually understand why. She flipped open to the first chapter. Justice is not about power. It is about fairness. But fairness does not exist on its own. It must be fought for, built, and protected. True justice requires us to confront our own biases, to question what we have always accepted, and to recognize that discomfort is not oppression. It is growth. Karen sat back, exhaling slowly. Her biases. She had never thought of herself as a bad person. But when she thought back to the cafe, to the way she had mocked Ms. Alfed, dismissed her, judged her without a second thought, she realized that she had been so certain of her own rightness, she had never stopped to consider if she was actually wrong. She had been. And that realization hurt. She kept reading, drawn in by Ms. Alfayed's words. The book wasn't just about legal battles. It was about people. About the way discrimination wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was quiet. It was in the assumptions people made. It was in who they thought deserved respect and who they thought didn't. It was in the way Karen had treated her. By the time she looked up from the book, 2 hours had passed. Karen rubbed her temples, feeling exhausted but unsettled. Had she been this blind her entire life? She had never seen herself as part of the problem. But today had shown her that maybe she was. And now she had to figure out what to do about it. Karen closed the book, pressing her fingers against her temples. Her head ached, not from exhaustion but from realization. She had spent hours reading, absorbing every word, every example of bias, discrimination, and systemic injustice that Ms. Alfayed had outlined so eloquently and irrefutably. And for the first time she saw herself in the pages. She had never thought of herself as racist. Never thought of herself as someone who contributed to the very problems activists like Ms. Alfayed fought against. But today had forced her to look at herself differently. Her reaction in the cafe hadn't been some random moment of rudeness. It had been a reflection of years of unchecked prejudice. And that terrified her. Karen pushed back from the table, pacing her kitchen. She didn't like this feeling. This guilt. This uncertainty. She had spent so much time believing she was right, that people like Ms. Alfayed were the ones pushing too hard, making too much noise about things that weren't that serious. But now she saw the truth. She had been the one refusing to listen. She ran a hand over her face, sighing. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this wasn't such a big deal. But another part of her, the part she had spent all night trying to ignore, knew that wasn't true. This was a big deal. And she didn't know what to do about it. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. A text from Lisa, her best friend. Lisa, brunch tomorrow? Same place? Karen hesitated. Lisa was just like her. They had spent years together rolling their eyes at social justice warriors and laughing at the idea of privilege. Lisa would never understand this. But the thought of sitting across from her, pretending that today hadn't happened, pretending that she hadn't been forced to see herself in a way she never had before, made Karen feel suffocated. She typed out a quick response. Karen, not feeling great. Brain check. Lisa's reply came instantly. Lisa, ugh, fine. Feel better. Karen set the phone down and stared at the book again. She needed to do something. But what? What was she supposed to do with this new awareness? She had spent so long being part of the problem. How did she even begin to change? She exhaled, rubbing her temples. She didn't have an answer. But for the first time in her life, she was willing to ask the question. And maybe, just maybe, that was where change started. Karen sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. The world outside her window carried on as if nothing had changed. Cars drove by, people walked their dogs, neighbors carried grocery bags into their apartments. But inside her, everything felt different. She had always assumed she was a good person. That she was just honest. That people who pushed back against her comments were simply too sensitive. But now she was starting to understand that it had never been about honesty. It had been about power. And for years she had been using hers carelessly. She looked back at the book, still open on the table. There was a section she had skimmed earlier, one she wasn't ready to process then. Now she forced herself to read it. People often ask, what can I do? When they realize they've contributed to injustice. The answer is simple: listen. Educate yourself. Accept that you may be part of the problem. And then do the work to change it. It's not about making yourself feel better. It's about making sure that your actions no longer contribute to harm. Karen exhaled, closing the book. It wasn't enough to just feel bad. She had to do something. But what? How did she start? A thought crept into her mind, one she had been avoiding all night. She needed to apologize. Not just to clear her own conscience, but because she had been wrong. She reached for her phone and opened her browser, typing Layla Al-Fayed into the search bar. Instantly, hundreds of results popped up. News articles, interviews, speaking engagements. She was everywhere. Karen clicked on one of the articles. It was an interview from a few months ago. As she read, she felt even smaller. This woman wasn't just an activist. She was a force of nature. She had spent years fighting for people who had been overlooked, mistreated, discriminated against. And Karen had stood in a cafe and tried to humiliate her over a coffee order. Her stomach churned. She clicked on another link, Ms. Al-Fayed's official website. At the bottom of the page there was a contact form. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. What was she even supposed to say? Sorry I was a racist jerk in a cafe? She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. Then, before she could overthink it, she started typing. Subject, I owe you an apology. Dear Ms. Al-Fayed, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I need to say it anyway. My name is Karen. We crossed paths today at the cafe. I was the woman who made an assumption about you before I even knew who you were. I judged you unfairly. I treated you with disrespect. And I was wrong. I have spent my entire life believing I was a good person. But today made me realize that being good isn't just about intentions. It's about actions. And my actions today were ugly. I can't change what I did, but I can change how I move forward. I'm truly sorry. Sincerely, Karen. She stared at the message for a long time. Then, with a deep breath, she hit send. For the first time in her life, she had admitted she was wrong. And somehow, that felt like the biggest change of all. Karen stared at the screen for a long time after hitting send. A part of her expected instant relief, some kind of weight lifting off her shoulders. But it didn't come. The apology was out there, but what if it wasn't enough? What if it didn't matter? What if Ms. Al-Fayed never even saw it? She pushed the laptop away, rubbing her temples. The truth was, this wasn't about a response. It was about her own realization, about the fact that she had spent her entire life walking through the world assuming she had all the answers. That her perspective was the default, that the way she saw things was simply the way they were. And now she knew how small her world had been. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Could people really change? She had never believed it before. She had always assumed that people were who they were, that if someone was a certain way they would stay that way. That's why she had never seen herself as part of the problem, because if she did, then that would mean she had to change. And change was uncomfortable. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts, her finger hovering over Lisa's name. Lisa wouldn't understand. If Karen told her what had happened today, she'd probably laugh it off, tell her she was being dramatic, that people were always looking for a reason to be offended. And a week ago, Karen would have agreed. But now she wasn't so sure. She put the phone down. She wasn't ready to talk about this with Lisa. She wasn't even sure she was ready to talk about it with herself. She got up from the table and walked to the window, watching the street below. People walked past, lost in their own worlds, their own problems, their own realities. Had she ever really considered anyone else's reality before? Had she ever stopped to think about what it felt like to walk into a place and wonder if people would judge her for simply existing? She thought about Ms. Al-Fayed standing at the cafe counter, the quiet dignity in her posture even as Karen had belittled her. She had carried herself with a kind of grace that Karen didn't understand. She had been calm, composed, not because she was weak but because she had probably been through worse. Karen felt a deep, twisting shame. She had always seen herself as strong, as assertive, as someone who said what needed to be said. But what if her strength had just been a shield? What if her confidence had just been ignorance? She sat back down, pulling the book toward her again. She wasn't done reading. She needed to know more, to understand more, because this wasn't just about one moment in a cafe. This was about her entire life. She turned the page and kept reading, because for the first time she actually wanted to learn. Karen's eyes scanned the words on the page, but she wasn't just reading, she was absorbing. Every chapter unraveled another layer of her understanding, peeling back the beliefs she had held onto for so long without ever questioning them. Ms. Al-Fayed wrote about systemic biases, about how discrimination didn't always come in the form of outright hatred but in the small, everyday moments. Assumptions, dismissals, the quiet ways people were told they weren't welcome. Karen felt a strange sense of recognition as she read. Not because she had experienced discrimination, but because she had been the one enforcing it, whether she realized it or not. The cafe wasn't the first time she had spoken without thinking, assumed without knowing. It was just the first time she had been forced to see herself from the outside. She thought about the way she had treated service workers, how she had rolled her eyes at people who struggled with English, how she had sighed impatiently when she saw someone wearing cultural clothing in public. It had never seemed like a big deal to her. But now she understood, it had been a big deal to them. She turned the page, her chest tightening at the next passage. Real change does not come from feeling guilty. Guilt is passive. It centers the person who caused harm rather than the person who was harmed. If you truly want to change, you must do the work. And that work is not about seeking redemption. It is about taking responsibility. Karen shut the book for a moment, closing her eyes. Guilt is passive. She had been sitting in her apartment, feeling bad about herself, waiting for some kind of relief to come. But that wasn't enough. Feeling bad wouldn't undo what she had done. It wouldn't erase the looks from the people in the cafe. It wouldn't change the way she had made Ms. Al-Fayed feel. She had sent the apology email, but even that had been about her own guilt, not about truly fixing anything. She needed to do more. Karen's gaze flicked back to her phone, Lisa's unread messages still sitting there. She knew what Lisa would say if she told her any of this. Karen, are you seriously still thinking about that? Let it go. People get offended too easily these days. You didn't mean anything by it. And for the first time, Karen realized she didn't want to hear those words. Because she did mean something by it. Maybe not in the way Lisa thought, but her words had carried weight. They had mattered. She had to take responsibility for that. Karen exhaled and picked up her phone. But instead of texting Lisa, she did something she had never done before. She searched for books, documentaries, and resources, things that would help her learn more. Because this wasn't just about one mistake. This was about everything she had ignored for years. And she was finally ready to face it. Karen's fingers hovered over the screen, scrolling through a list of books, articles, and documentaries that she never would have even considered looking at before today. She hesitated. A part of her still felt the instinct to push this away, to excuse it, to tell herself that she wasn't really part of the problem. But she couldn't unsee what had happened. She couldn't unhear her own voice at the cafe, the way she had spoken with such casual cruelty, the way she had dismissed someone without knowing a single thing about them. That moment was permanent. And so was the knowledge that it had only mattered to her because she had been caught. She swallowed hard and tapped on a book recommendation. It was another one by Ms. Al-Fayed, a deeper dive into how privilege and unconscious bias shape daily interactions. Karen had always hated that word, privilege. She had always thought of herself as someone who had worked hard for everything she had. But for the first time she saw what she had never had to work for. She had never had to defend her right to exist in a space. She had never had to prove that she belonged in a coffee shop. She had never been judged before even opening her mouth. And yet, she had spent years assuming that the world was fair to everyone just because it had always been fair to her. That assumption had been shattered now. And she had to decide what she was going to do with that. Karen sat back, her mind racing. Would she still be thinking about this in a week? Would she still feel the same in a month? Or would she slowly let herself forget, falling back into her old habits, laughing at the same jokes, rolling her eyes at people who took things too seriously? She had a choice. For the first time in her life, she actually understood that. She picked up her phone and started reading. Not because she wanted to feel better, but because she wanted to be better. And this time she wasn't going to stop until she was. Karen read late into the night, absorbing every word, every example, every story. The more she read, the more she saw herself in ways she had never dared to before. She had spent years believing that being a good person was enough. That she wasn't racist, she wasn't prejudiced, she didn't hate anyone. So what was there to fix? But now she understood. It wasn't just about hate. It was about complacency. It was about the moments she had let slide, the jokes she had laughed at, the dismissive comments she had agreed with, the way she had always assumed that people who talked about discrimination were overreacting. She thought back to all the Karens before her. The women in her social circle who had rolled their eyes when a coworker brought up diversity in a meeting. The ones who scoffed at the idea that people were treated differently because of race, religion, gender. And then there was herself. She had never questioned what it meant to be welcomed everywhere. To never be looked at with suspicion. To never feel out of place in a store, a cafe, a meeting, a neighborhood. Ms. Al-Fayed had probably spent her entire life having to prove herself. Karen had never had to prove anything. And that realization felt heavier than all the shame in the world. She ran a hand through her hair, staring at the screen. The words blurred together, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Change wasn't comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. She reached for her phone, hesitating only a moment before deleting Lisa's number. It felt like something small, but it wasn't. Lisa wasn't going to understand this. And Karen didn't want to spend her life around people who made her question if she should. She closed the book, knowing she had only scratched the surface. This wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in her life, Karen wasn't looking for easy. She was looking for better. And she wasn't going to stop until she found it.